Whenever the federal government spends, we will select Canadian suppliers by default, rather than using the current best efforts approach. And this new approach will extend to all federal agencies, all Crown corporations. And in those cases, when domestic suppliers aren't available, purchases will be required to include Canadian content or to be sourced from trusted partners. And those cases will be the exception, not the norm. And they will require ministerial approval.
That was Prime Minister Mark Carney in New Brunswick today, laying out more details of his government's Buy Canadian policy, including nearly $186 million in funding from the federal budget to fully implement the economic strategy. New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt joins me now. Premier, it's good to see you again. Thank you for being here today.
Always good to be with you, David.
So the Prime Minister is selling the merits of his budget, including the new Buy Canadian policy. Your forestry sector, the way it's being hit by what's happening in the U.S., very likely stands to benefit from that. Well, how could this help that industry in your province?
Well, look, the more things that are made with New Brunswick wood and Canadian wood, the better. And reminding folks that we have the best forest products in the world here in Canada. And convincing them to maybe do some swapping out is a good thing for our industry. Look, we're thinking about things that we built with materials other than wood that we could replace and start building with wood. And so anytime you have the Prime Minister in your province encouraging people to buy more of what you do best, it's a good day. It creates opportunity for the sector.
But when you look at the size and scale of the exports to the U.S. market from that sector, I mean, as ambitious as the Buy Canadian policy might be, I mean, how much of it can it really offset, I wonder?
Yeah, the U.S. is a huge customer for New Brunswick and for New Brunswick softwood lumber and forestry producers and value-added manufacturers. We send a lot of kitchen cabinets and other products down to the U.S. And so we've been working really closely with the industry to make sure that they have maximized every possible Atlantic Canadian customer that they can, and that they're getting teed up for new markets that are further abroad, and that we're helping make it competitive for them to reach those markets.
How are individual producers in your province holding up right now? Because we've talked to Ravi Parmar, the forest minister from British Columbia, a few times, and Premier David Eby, and they've got sawmills rolling back, you know, just they're not chopping down trees at certain places because there is no market for it. How is that rippling through your forestry sector?
Well, New Brunswick forest producers are extremely resilient and extremely dedicated. So we've been fortunate so far here that we have only seen a very small number of layoffs, even though the customers aren't buying to the same extent. Our producers have their inventory and are keeping their shifts on and keeping their employees engaged as we do everything we can to help them be competitive in this new tariffed price market and get new customers online quickly and new uses online. So, you know, we've got a pretty tough sector that has built up some of that thick skin over time. But we also really need to see the federal government come through with the kind of supports that'll help us bridge through this period of intense tariffs differently than the current package of loan guarantees that are on the table. So I was pleased to hear Prime Minister Carney say when he was in Fredericton today that we can expect those supports to come in the next couple weeks.
Okay, well, is this over and above what he talked about and him and his other ministers talked about with the British Columbia ministers? Like, I know we focus a lot on the West Coast when we talk about softwood lumber, but it affects New Brunswick, it affects Quebec. Just it's not as dominant maybe in the scale of their economic share. But is this something specific for New Brunswick in addition to what we've seen on the larger industry?
The Prime Minister says that they'll be putting out a national program for softwood lumber supports. And so they're getting input from New Brunswick right now and our producers on what we need here, because our industry is a bit of a different makeup than the makeup in British Columbia and in Quebec. And so they're prepared to have the kind of package of supports that is going to work from coast to coast to coast, and that might apply differently to producers in BC, but work for folks here in New Brunswick. So we're just making sure that everyone knows what we need so that when they finalize and announce the packages in a couple weeks, then it'll it'll do what it needs to do for this critical industry in New Brunswick.
So they wouldn't have to do any of these things if they could get some resolution with the United States. I wonder if in your conversations with the Prime Minister, if you got a sense of where things stand with the state of those talks, because they have been off, they have been stalled, and while there's been some contact, it doesn't seem like it's restarted or is on the verge of restarting. What's your sense after meeting with Mr. Kearney?
Yeah, well, my sense is that there is an opportunity to restart the softwood lumber conversation. The industry has been working really hard to come to a common shared position, and given the negotiating team the tools to take those offers to the American coalition and start getting us to a place where maybe there's something that we can work back and forth on in relation to the 35% tariffs. This still leaves the 232 tariffs as a bit of a separate thing that will have to come with the CUSMA and the other negotiations. But I think what the Prime Minister and I discussed today is that there's some pretty clear next steps that we want to see the federal government take with their counterparts in the US, and that we're hopeful that those will move the discussions forward.
Okay, that's on softwood specific, though. On the sectoral tariffs on CUSMA, it's still status quo. Nothing's happening, as far as you know, after your meeting today? Yes?
It feels that way on the CUSMA piece. It feels like that things are pretty frozen.
Okay. So, look, in addition to the Buy Canada discussion today, the Prime Minister also said get ready for Thursday because the next list of major projects is coming. I know you've been pushing for things like a port, port upgrades, you've been pushing for movement on critical minerals. Do you have a sense of whether or not New Brunswick is going to be any part of the action on Thursday when the Prime Minister unveils the next set of, I guess, winners, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, well, I was really pleased to hear the Prime Minister confirm in his press conference and event today that New Brunswick will be on the list of the next major projects announced on Thursday. And so we've been working really hard to find the right pathways for those critical projects for us, and getting one of those projects designated with the major projects list is great news for New Brunswick. We have some pathways on the other projects that we're also really encouraged by. But we're really looking forward to Thursday because it will mean a good opportunity for a lot of New Brunswickers who could benefit from this work and its importance on a national scale.
Well, what is your sense of where you're more likely to see some movement? Would it be on the infrastructure side or is it going to be on the extraction side? Because there's a real emphasis on getting to the Pacific markets, it seems, and getting critical minerals, LNG, and things like that going at scale. Is the critical mineral option more likely, do you think, for New Brunswick on Thursday? Where do you think it stands?
Well, I don't want to scoop the Prime Minister's announcement on Thursday. So we are seeing a lot of positive response to our critical minerals environment here in New Brunswick, and particularly our Sisson project. We're seeing really positive response to the projects proposed at the Port of St. John and at the Port of Belledune. Clearly, the proposal that we made on modular housing landed well, with the Prime Minister being at Maple Leaf Homes today to talk about buying Canadian and from leading home manufacturers like Maple Leaf. So I'm optimistic that I know. I mean, obviously, we know what the announcement is on Thursday, so I'll let the Prime Minister share that. Okay. But it's important for Canada.
Okay. All right. Well,
New Brunswick is proud to play a role and see our projects on the major projects list nationally.
Okay, I suspect you scooping him would make it harder to get another private meeting, so I understand your reticence to do those things. But there's going to, just as a final point, Premier, we know there's going to be a First Minister's meeting of some sort on Monday, the day after the Grey Cup. You will have had a couple of pretty important bits of economic policy pieces from the federal government, the budget and the next list of major projects, expanding things out in quite a way. And presumably there may be some sort of larger update on the state of the U.S. talks. What is your sense of where things stand right now with the economic direction being outlined by the government and the comfort level at the Premier's table with where this is going? Because I know the Premiers also had a conversation earlier today.
Yeah, we did have a meeting with Canada's premiers for the Council of the Federation, and we talked about the federal budget and about the meeting to come next week. A lot of us have questions about the infrastructure funding, both its scale and its applicability, because as the Prime Minister has said himself, now is the time to build and put that critical infrastructure in place for trade, for energy, for our communities. And you've likely heard some of the premier's comment about whether they think that the funds allocated in the budget are sufficient to do as much as needs to be done at a time when provincial budgets are seeing a real squeeze on revenues, a real reduction on revenues, actually. I think across the country, you're seeing deficit positions,
Right.
province after province. And so when we talk about this being the strongest economy in the G7, when the Prime Minister talks about this budget really spurring building in Canada, the premiers want to understand how quickly is that going to happen? And is the scale sufficient to meet the moment?
And do they think, just as a quick final point, do they think it's large enough? Because the total macro number looks big, but it's spread out over many years and some of it was already there, right? So do you think it falls a bit short?
I think that's it. We're all trying to eke out what is actual new money,
Right.
what's money that was previously existing under other funds. And when you look at the scale of the projects, right? We have projects here in New Brunswick that are hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars actually to
Right.
build out. And so if you look at a $22 billion over multiple years community infrastructure fund, and you spread that across a country as vast and diverse as Canada. But we're all asking ourselves,
Right.
who's going to get that money and for what, and how is it going to be allocated equitably? And we here in New Brunswick always look for our unique reality to be recognized. We don't want to see a one-size-fits-all program because clearly we have both different population makeups, different densities, different geographic realities, and others. So lots of questions and conversation to be had about the infrastructure investments that the federal government has signaled.
New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt, always appreciate the time. Thanks for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, David.
So what are other premiers hoping to get out of this next list of projects? R.J. Simpson is the Premier of Northwest Territories, and he joins me now. Premier, it's good to see you again. Thanks for being here, sir.
Always happy to be here.
We spoke with Susan Holt earlier, and she's happy that one of her projects is going to be on this list on Thursday. Do you have any sense yet whether the Northwest Territory will get one of the projects that it's been advocating for?
No, I don't have a sense. I think our projects are still a little bit out. They're a few years out. So as long as we have that relationship with the major projects officer and as long as we stay on the federal government's radar, I'm happy. We don't need to be on this next list. But I do know that there's a lot of interest from the federal government in our major projects.
Okay, there is also a lot of interest in building out Arctic infrastructure. I think there was $1 billion for it in the budget. And if you look at where they're going with a lot of the defense spending, there's also obviously a play that will greatly affect your territory. What are your thoughts on what you saw in the budget in terms of the Arctic development programs?
Well, I got to say that I'm happy with this budget. I've been in this role for a few years. I've been in politics for a few years longer. And it's always been a struggle for the North to get any sort of attention from the federal government. That's what it's felt like, at least. But in this budget, I see reflected the conversations that I've had, my cabinet has had with our federal counterparts. So there is the Arctic Infrastructure Fund. It's $1 billion over 4 years, which is really a drop in the bucket for an area with very, very little infrastructure. But it is something that's dedicated to the Arctic, and it's something that's needed. And so the devil's in the details. What is the Arctic exactly? Is that north of the Arctic Circle? Is that the tundra? Who's eligible? So there's a lot of questions to unpack, but nonetheless, I'm happy to see that in there. And it's part of a suite of announcements that can benefit us. So there's also more of a focus on critical minerals and getting those out of the ground. And there's support, it's actually dedicated support, almost $70 million for accelerating the regulatory process in Canada's north. And that includes things like consulting with Indigenous governments. So there's actually quite a bit in here for the North. There's obviously a lot more that we would like to see, but it's a good start.
Well, just in our conversations in the past, Premier, you've talked about the need for dual-use infrastructure, and if the projects that you've talked about are like the Arctic Economic and Security Corridor, the All-Weather Road. These are things that have been referenced by the Prime Minister many times. And if you look at the massive increase in defense spending in this budget, it really does seem that beyond the $1 billion just for Arctic infrastructure, there's a multiplier effect with the defense spending that could potentially get that dual purpose infrastructure that you've been talking about.
Yeah, it does seem like they are preparing for a future where there's more defense capability in the north. And so if we're going to have more troops stationed in Inuvik, which is one of the forward operating locations, well, there's going to need to be upgrades within that community, things like water treatment plants and roads. And this Arctic Infrastructure Fund, while it's not big enough really to build the big projects that we're looking at, those are multi-billion-dollar projects, there is enough in there to work on some of those parts of those projects that we're permitted for now and we can get shovels in the ground now. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see some quick wins with this money, but also that it'll allow us to accelerate the work to get the big projects completed.
Okay, those big multi-billion-dollar projects that you're talking about. We spoke with Premier Holt, as I said earlier in the show, and I know in a week you're going to meet with the Prime Minister, but today the Premier spoke at the Council of the Federation. And what Premier Holt expressed was some concerns over just how all the infrastructure money in this budget is going to work, whether there's enough of it to meet the needs across the country, how exactly you qualify, what exactly the strings are that would be attached to it. When you look at the billion set aside for the Arctic infrastructure, but those other projects you need, do you share Premier Holt's concerns about the lack of scale and maybe the lack of specificity on the government's infrastructure plans?
Well, there's never going to be enough money, I don't think, to satisfy any of us in terms of the infrastructure that we need. But like I said, I'm happy that there's an Arctic-specific focus on here. And that said, when we have our big infrastructure projects, when they're ready to go, it's going to need a lot more money. And so the federal government, we've had positive signals from them that there's the money here in these pots, but there's also the potential for some larger investments when we have those one-off projects like the Mackenzie Valley Highway, like the Arctic Economic Corridor and the Tulsan Hydro expansion. All of those projects contribute to national security, to sovereignty, and to helping really develop a secure supply chain that Canada needs if we want to achieve our industrial goals.
So these other projects, they could very well be their own thing. Outside of the existing programs, they could be like bespoke funding for those to make them happen, is what your anticipation might be.
Yeah, so for the Mackenzie Valley Highway, we have a couple of bridges right now that are ready to go. They're permitted. If we can access this Arctic Infrastructure Fund for those, that would be great. But the overall, the 700 kilometers of road, we're looking well over $1 billion, and that's more than any of the funds can provide right now.
Okay, so the Premier spoke today. The First Ministers will meet a week from today when you have this meeting with the Prime Minister, which we are led to believe now would be more of a virtual meeting. I was under the impression everyone was going to be in Winnipeg for the Grey Cup. That's where the major projects would be announced, but now we're going to get the projects on Thursday. The Grey Cup is still on Sunday, and then the First Ministers meet on Monday. What are you hoping to learn from the Prime Minister at that First Ministers meeting a week from now? Because it's been a while since there was a big update on Canada-US talks. The economic plan is out with the major projects list and with the budget. What do you want to hear from Mark Carney when you all get together again? Well,
I want to hear updates on all those things and also let him know it's a good opportunity for us to get in front of the Prime Minister and talk about our issues, what we're seeing. I'm very interested to know the plans for the major projects. Like you said, we're going to have some announcements here. We'll know soon enough